When the call eventually came, it wasn't the news I had been expecting. Weeks of preparation ended abruptly when I learned that before I was able to donate my bone marrow, the child who was to receive it had died. I remember feeling very disappointed, but even more so, I was sad for the family that had just lost a child which my body might have been able to save. I said 2004, and it was actually 2006. That's what I looked like back then, less grey hair. The man my wife fell in love with, she told me when I put that photo up. It was 2006, and I was a physician trainee at St George Hospital. I'd been donating blood regularly since I was a medical student. And I can't remember when exactly, but at some point they asked me if I wanted to join the Australian Bone Marrow Donor Registry. Didn't seem like a big deal. Just a couple of extra tubes of blood with my regular donation. At that stage, I understood the chances of actually being matched with someone were pretty low. The chance of being matched with an unrelated person in need of a stem cell transplant is less than 1 for every 1,500 people who are on the registry in any 1 year. So when the donation coordinator reached me, I had forgotten that I was even on the registry. But I quickly became excited at the prospect of being able to help someone in a very special and unique way. I started talking about it at work and found out that one of my colleagues had been through the process, so I started to learn about what I might expect. He was a renal physician as well. And then what followed were a series of surveys, clinical assessments, laboratory tests. I have a very vivid memory of coming to RPA and being examined by haematologist Graham Young, who's now retired, a sort of tall Scottish man. The final step was being issued with a box of syringes filled with this miraculous drug that makes it all possible, called granulocyte colony stimulating factor, or GCSF. This is the best picture I could find of that. I didn't take any photos of injecting myself. But I would need to inject myself with this every day for a week to turn my bone marrow into a stem cell making machine. For the dose I needed, it would be 2 separate syringes given each evening, and 2 separate needles. Now, self-injecting is something that many people do every day as part of their routine care, diabetes, renal patients, lots of other patients with clotting disorders. And I was often prescribing these injections to others, but I'd never had to do it to myself. So all I was waiting for was a start date to start the injections. But sadly, I never got to use them. There was so much anticipation and excitement that when I had to return to work and it hadn't gone ahead, it felt like a failure, even though it was nothing that I'd done myself. Now let's fast forward a decade. When I listened to a voicemail from a phone call I missed on a ward round, I really didn't expect to be hearing from the donor coordinator again. So much had changed in my life. I was a consultant now, I was married, I had 2 children. My life was completely different, and I was no longer a regular blood donor because I just couldn't fit it into life anymore. My first reaction was, how did you manage to find me after all these years? But it's amazing how little we change our mobile phone numbers. So if someone's got it, they'll be able to track you down. But my next reaction was amazement. I mean, what was the chance of being matched to 2 different people in a 10-year period? So this time I was careful, though, not to get as excited about the whole thing. It was a bit like that 1980s Australian TV show Perfect Match, where I was one of several potential donors, and after a series of questions and assessments, the best donor would be selected. And so it began again. Long questionnaires, dozens of tubes of blood, some of which had to be collected twice because of administrative errors. A chest x-ray, an ECG, and another clinical assessment. And this time it was Dr. Christian Bryant at RPA that got the honours. And it was a little more awkward because I'd known Christian as a registrar And so I was now stripping off in front of someone I knew as a colleague, and it's a lot more personal. But the most awkward questions came from Louise Kerr, who's the bone marrow transplant coordinator. Was I having sex with anyone other than my wife? Was I injecting drugs? Did I have any sneaky tattoos somewhere that no one knew about? For the record, it was no, no, and no. Eventually, it was decided that I was the best match, and I was given the GCSF syringes to take home and keep in my fridge, waiting for a date to start. And this time, I got to use them. So one of the side effects of these injections is bone pain. As the bone marrow goes into overdrive, making your stem cells, it compresses the inside of the bones and you get this deep aching pressure, a constant ache, especially at night. It's like having the flu. It was much worse than I expected, but to my amazement, I've never put much faith in paracetamol, it actually pretty much abolished the symptoms. It was proof in the pudding from my point of view. Once the injection started, I was fully committed to the process because at the same time, the person who was going to receive my transplant was also being prepared. They were undergoing chemotherapy themselves to completely wipe out their own bone marrow in preparation for receiving mine. After 4 days of these injections, which my sons thought were very interesting, watching Daddy do this every night, it was interesting because about half of them hurt. So it seems like you can sort of get them in there and sometimes they don't hurt and sometimes they do, and it's very hard to predict. Anyway, after 4 days of this, my white cell count was hitting about 40 when normal is about 7. I was feeling pretty lethargic and breathless when I wouldn't normally feel like that. I was definitely ready for the collection, but there were more needles to come. Hemodialysis is a treatment that I prescribe to my patients every day. It involves putting large needles into a special vein, usually in their arm, running their blood out of their body into a machine before running it back into their bodies. And what I was about to experience was pretty much the same thing that I do to my patients. Donating bone marrow used to involve putting large needles into the back of the pelvis bones and sucking out the bone marrow, pulling out the stem cells and then injecting that into the recipient. But thanks to this magic little injection of GCSF, those stem cells now fly out into the bloodstream and can be collected through a process known as apheresis. To do this, I had to have one large cannula inserted into each of my arms. On the side from which the blood was taken, which you have a picture of here, there's a gently tightened tourniquet just above my elbow to keep the pressure up. And I had a little green squeezy piece of foam that I had to keep compressing every few seconds to keep the blood flowing to my arm so the machine wouldn't alarm. And here I am all hooked up. I had to keep my arms straight so I didn't kink the cannulas. And I was surrounded by other patients who were having the same treatments. I brought my iPad to keep myself entertained, but I needed help to get the headphones on because I couldn't get my hands up to my head. I even arranged to have a short work meeting with a colleague at RPA just to help me pass the time. He was also a hematologist, so he wasn't put off by the whole thing. I couldn't get my hands to my mouth to feed myself, and I tried not to drink too much water because I really didn't want to have to pee in a bottle, standing up, connected to the machine. But I couldn't avoid it because the collection went for 5 hours. In total, the machine processed 14 litres of blood, which is my whole blood volume, in and out through that machine 2.5 times. After about 4 hours, my lips and fingers started to tingle as my calcium levels started to drop, which is one of the side effects of the treatment. What I was craving was a banana milkshake because I knew that I could hold that close enough that I could drink it through a straw and get some calcium in. And Louise Kerr went above and beyond, scouring the hospital to find me a banana milkshake. But even that wasn't enough, and I had to have some extra calcium injected to get my calcium level back up. And after all that, at the end of the collection, there were actually not enough cells. And I had to come back the next day and do it for another 3 hours to collect enough stem cells for the transplant. All right, so somewhere in that dark blood and the white stuff sitting above it are the precious stem cells that were going to become the red cells, the white cells, and the platelets in somebody else's body. Those amazing little cells are going to give someone else a chance at a second life. And did they work? Well, this time the story has a happy ending. A year after the donation, I received a card from the person who received my stem cells. And you can hear how things went for them in their own words. Dear bone marrow donor, I want to say a deep, heartfelt thank you for your huge generosity in donating your bone marrow. Thank you doesn't seem to be enough to express how I feel. I have a deep gratitude for the time and discomfort that you went through for me to receive your bone marrow and to bring health and wholeness to my body. I'm sorry it's taken me this long to thank you, but the first few months of recovery were quite grueling and difficult. But I am now on the other side, and I can say I feel fabulous. Life is back to normal, but I have a whole new perspective on the day of living, and I wake up every morning excited about the days, weeks, and years ahead. What I took away from this process was a first-hand experience of what treatments are like to the patients, my patients, every day. And I can vouch for the amazing service that we provide in Sydney LHD to our patients and to our staff. They looked after me very well. And I would certainly encourage everybody to join the Australian Bone Marrow Donor Registry, because the more people that join, the better the chances that someone will find a match that might save their life. For the next few years, I'm off the registry, just in case my recipient needs some more stem cells. But if I ever get that call again, I won't hesitate to say yes. Thank you.